Hello there, students. So we are going to be working through the what I call American culture and the other. And this is going to make up some of the content that we've missed. You can see the dates there. It goes from 1880 to 1945. Remember that 1945 is the end date for this year's test here in 2020. And so we want to make sure that we're getting all the content we missed. We sped through basically from World War One, and we didn't even get to World War II yet. So we're gonna tackle that period by looking at a few topics. And the first topic we're looking at is how American culture relates to people that were not necessarily considered to be a part of it. And so the first video here is going to focus on American Indians. We haven't actually. I was planning on going back to this, but then coronavirus. And so here it is. This is our coverage of issues with Native Americans in the latter part of the 19th century, all the way up through World War II. So this is part one. We'll have a few other parts to this. And if you downloaded the outline from Google Classroom, you can see what parts are after this. We've got African Americans, we've got immigrants, we've got Asian Americans. And so here we go without further ado. So I wanted to start by giving us a little bit of a reminder of the background before we even get to 1880. And so as you can see, I'm reminding us here about the placement of the colonies and how all this relates to American Indian relations in the early part of the 19th century and even before. So we start in the colonial period. Remember, that's when our pattern starts. And this is a pattern that we've been talking about since August, where there is some sort of conflict between American Indians and Europeans, and then later Americans. That conflict is won by the Europeans or the Americans because of superior technology. A treaty is made, and this is the treaty that's made after the French and Indian War. Here is the proclamation line of 1763. Remember, the Indians were told, you can have this land and we'll stay over here. But then, as we know, the Euro-American settlers have a much higher fertility rate than the semi-nomadic, semi-hunter-gatherer Indian tribes. And so their population grows and grows, and we have this, if we were talking about cause of the American Revolution, the proclamation in 1763 was kind of one of those things where the American colonists were like, no, but we want to go over there. The British government was like, no, you can't, because we've given that land to the Native Americans. And eventually, after the American Revolution, American settlers started moving into that land. And as that pattern goes, eventually there's going to be conflict. That conflict is going to grow into the War of 1812, when Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief, he created a pan-Indian alliance of all the Indians living in this area, or a good chunk of them. And as part of, kind of connected tangentially to the War of 1812, carried on a war against the American army, and the generals and later presidents Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison are going to be instrumental in putting down that rebellion. Of course, when Jackson becomes president, he is going to remove the Indians from the southern area here and down into Florida through the Indian Removal Act. Sorry, that's a typo. What we call the Trail of Tears, moving them to Oklahoma Territory over here. At the end of 1812, these Indians were forced to move west as well. There we've got some movement of the Trail of Tears there, showing all the different. These were, remember, were what was called the 5 civilized tribes. They did not join in Tecumseh's rebellion because they had already adopted Christianity and in some ways Western European style education. But nonetheless, they were removed anyway. And we can go back over that in some review sessions later. So now if we get down to our new era that we're talking about here, getting closer to 1880, right around, starting with the Removal Act under Jackson, we start to have what's called the reservation policy. A reservation, definition of a reservation, is area that is reserved for the Indians. Oklahoma Territory was reserved for the American Indians that had moved west during the Trail of Tears. But in a little bit, 3 years after the American Civil War, we have the creation of the Great Sioux Reservation and other Indian reservations in the northern Great Plains, and it was created by something called the Fort Laramie Treaty. The first one was actually in 1851, and so that's before the Civil War. And you see that land here, and so this is following in that pattern that we've now, because of a series of treaties, we've given this land to the Indians, and that's their land. But as American population grows and as American, let's call it, wants grow, we're going to start going into that territory, and we're going to start claiming that territory. You'll see here that the Black Hills, there's later, and we'll get to this, there's going to be found gold right there in the center. So what do you do with that middle area? The other problem with the reservation policy was that the Indians that we forced together in many ways were Indians that didn't get along in the first place. So under these reservation policies, they have hunting rights and they have farming rights in that area. And if the Native Americans did not assent to go into that area, they were going to be forced to. And so we have a series of wars. We start to call this the Indian War period. And this is all over, because this is just a snapshot of what's going on in the Northern Great Plains. You have this issue in the Southwest, in California, and in several areas where there were Indians. Some Indians voluntarily went into these, and others didn't. And you have a whole series of wars where famous Indian leaders that you've probably heard of, like Geronimo was the Apache leader in the Southwest, that for years refused to go onto the reservations. But what these policies did was they refused Native Americans their rights to live the way that they always had for their ancestors, free hunting rights and things like that. Now all of a sudden they're trapped in by these kind of artificial borders, and that's going to lead to even more conflict. But what we have right here is the later. No, I'm sorry. This one over here is the later treaty, the second Fort Laramie Treaty, and you'll see that it's considerably smaller. If you look here at the boundaries, they've gotten considerably smaller here. Eventually, it gets down to this, and you'll see, if I know this is a blurry slide, but you can see that various parts of these over the course from 1868 up until the 20th century, various parts of these get cut up until this color is all that is left. Here is the Standing Rock Reservation, which is where you had some issues just a few years ago over oil right, or the rights to have an oil pipeline to go through there. Here is the Black Hills, and this is where there was the initial conflict, was where there was gold found. There was a gold rush in the Black Hills. A town called Deadwood was established against the wishes of the American government. Prospectors just came in, and they killed the Indians that they came into contact with. Eventually, it kind of falls into that kind of imperialism pattern that we looked at with places like Hawaii, where the American government said you can't go there. Americans did anyway to make money, and once the indigenous people caused enough problems, the American government said, well, we have to protect our people, and took the land away from the indigenous people. And so that's what happened for a lot of this area. Some of the other areas was lost through other things that we'll talk about here in a minute. And so can I move my picture? If I can. All right. So now, starting about 1890, we go into what's called the assimilation era. And this is once the reservations are established, now they're going to change. The American government is going to change its policy, and this is the official policy of the American government, is that now that we've got Indians living in reservations, now we're going to force them to assimilate. Any Indian that doesn't assimilate doesn't get to stay. And remember that not staying in the reservation is a death sentence. So they pass a law called the Dawes Allotment Act. And what that law says is basically it's the Homestead Act for Indians. It gives Indian heads of household a certain amount of land within the reservation. And they are charged then with, and that's called their allotment. And they're charged with improving that land. Remember, this is improving it through what the kind of the Western vision of what that means. If you remember, improving means farming it and building something on it. And what does farming look like? Well, Indians were farmers. They've been farming for years, for centuries, but it didn't always look just like European style farming. What the American governments want to see is they want to see fences. They want to see monocrop, meaning one crop. You're growing just grain. They don't want to see what was called the Three Sisters, which is where you had basically a mound, and you had corn growing out of that mound, and you had beans running up the corn, and then you had squash coming out the bottom. All those three, those were the staple crops for Indians across North and South America for thousands of years. And that was the way they grew them, because that was actually a perfect ecosystem. But they don't want to see that. And they don't want Indians just hunting. There's not going to be this idea that there's this open hunting land and this tribe is going to hunt here and that tribe's going to hunt here. They want these people to be like Americans and get their meat from the grocery store, essentially. And so you see the cartoons that I chose up here. Here's the U.S. government saying each man to his own plot. Well, it's a complete violation of the way that Native American culture it was very communal. Over here, these are both later cartoons, current cartoons, but the Dawes Act there is eating up the Indian lands, because just like the Homestead Act, what happens if you don't obey? If you don't improve that land, you lose it. And that's what was happening to Indians. And here you have Indian land for sale, where Indians that didn't follow the rules, they sold off their land to white farmers. And that's where we actually see a lot of this loss here. The other way that they accomplished assimilation, let me move my face out of theirs, was through the Indian school movement. And these were voluntary. There were some occasions where it was by force, but most of it was voluntary, at least to an extent. Because remember, if you don't follow the rules, you'll lose your land and you're kicked off the reservation, and that's a death sentence. So American Indian families allowed their children to go. Especially early on in this period, a lot of the chiefs wanted their children to go to these schools because they recognized that the future leaders of the tribes had to live within both worlds. But these schools are going to be designed to try to destroy the Indian part of their lives. In fact, the guy that started the most famous school is called the Carlisle School. I didn't put that on there. I should have. It's Carlisle, Carlisle School. It was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Was a military man, and his famous quote was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And so the idea was they were going to stamp out everything that was Indian about these people and make them into real men. And of course, all of this should remind you of the way that people talk, spoke, thought, drew, wrote about people in other lands, places like China, Africa, Philippines, things like that we talked about. We talked about imperialism. And so here we've got the industrial schools, and I've got some pictures of them. And once again, this should remind us of the times when we talked about Booker T. Washington and opportunities for African Americans in the South, that we're going to provide education, but it's industrial education. It's education to try to keep these people in the working class. The idea was a racist idea that non-whites couldn't handle anything above that, and so they are being trained on what would be then modern technology here, but of course they're doing it in a way. This is the kind of after picture. Here's the before picture. Here's the after picture of these Indians. They take them in and they always snap their picture in their traditional Indian garb, and then they put them in uniforms. And you'll see it's very militaristic. These were not military schools sanctioned by the U.S. government, but they were military-run schools. There were some that were religiously run, but that was much more common in Canada. These were run by private organizations, and they were run like military schools. But you see what they're doing. I mean, here, what are the women doing? The young Indian ladies, well, they're being taught to be housewives, to do traditional women's work, but it's done through a Euro-American style, not through. I mean, we all know that Indian tribes, especially by this late, had very distinct gender roles. And so a lot of this work was being done by females in the tribe anyway, but now they're going to do it the white way. And the other part of the Indian school movement was that they were allowed to do, they were allowed vacations, but those vacations were not allowed to be with their tribes. So their vacations, the schools would essentially lease them out to white families to do what was considered kind of an internship, but really what it was slave labor. And so a white family somewhere in Pennsylvania maybe might hire out a young Native American boy to intern them, and basically it would just be do all the yard work, or a young girl might do all the washing, be a nanny, these kinds of things. And it was setting these young people up to only be in the working class. And this should be contrasted to various forms of education that happened in the earlier periods, especially with those 5 civilized tribes before they were removed by Andrew Jackson, where especially religious groups would go in and give them Ivy League educations, teaching them Latin and rhetoric and things like that, which is why you have a lot more legal Supreme Court challenges to Native American treatment in that period than you do in this later period. There's only a few during this period, and they're generally unsuccessful. Whereas we know previously Worcester versus Georgia was founded in the Native Americans' favor by the Supreme Court, even though it wasn't enforced. So that kind of sums up the Indian schools. A lot of the, and we can talk about this later in a chat or something like that. But a lot of the Indians who went through this actually, rather than being able to lead their tribes through the later period as people who live in two worlds, which was what the intention was, at least by on the Native American side, a lot of them found that it was next to impossible because the whites didn't accept them because they were Indians, and the Indians didn't accept them because they were too white. The last portion that I want to cover here with Native Americans is the fact that not everybody went quietly. And so, we do have the legal challenges up there, even starting way back in 1790, where the Indians were challenging their treatment, and earlier on in the period, we can see if you look at the language of the findings that in 1790 the Supreme Court assented that Indians were separate free people, like a separate nation. They were called I forgot the terminology. I was just like to stop it. But by the time we get to 1856 and 1890, The language is like ward. By 1890, they're called wards of the state. So they're no longer free, independent, separate nations. They are. It's kind of that paternalistic language that they are wards. They are our children. The U.S.'s children that they have to take care of. Well, as I said, not you can't tell a grown man that he's a child, and a lot of Indians did not accept. And so one of the first major leader, especially among the Sioux, I'm going to cover the Great Plains Wars, but please be aware that this is not just the only area. These are the large scale ones, the ones that you hear about the most, and consequently the ones you're going to see most likely on the test. So this gentleman here is named Red Cloud. He has the most successful campaigns called Red Cloud's War, and it's a very long-standing war. He's a Sioux chief that refused to go on the reservation, and during the original Fort Laramie Treaty. The largest event was called the Fetterman Massacre here, so basically what happened is there was an ambush. Red Cloud would use this tactic where he would send out a few of his soldiers to trick the U.S. Army into pursuing these Indian warriors, thinking that they were a small group, and then overwhelming them. And the Fetterman Massacre was a large victory by Red Cloud, but it leads directly to another incident called the Sand Creek Massacre, which is where there was another group, and they were loosely associated with Red Cloud, but it was mostly the women, the children, and the elderly from Red Cloud's tribe that were actually agreeing to go into the reservation. When the army surrounded them, it was led by a person that personally wanted revenge for the Fetterman Massacre. And so there was, it's one of those things where who shot first, somebody moved, something like that. But essentially they mowed down all of the Indians there, even though most of them were defenseless. One of them, the leader of the tribe, a guy named Black Kettle, was actually flying a surrender flag, a white flag, and he was gunned down. And all that did was intensify Red Cloud's resolve. Eventually, Red Cloud, as part of the second Fort Laramie Treaty, he did sign on to that, and he was given certain provisions, which was he got to lay out the kind of deal that they got. And that caused all kinds of weird dynamics, because part of his deal was that he didn't want some of the other tribes, the Crow tribes that were in the northern section of that. He didn't want them. He wanted their land, and so since he was the one that was winning, the U.S. Army gave him that land and displaced the Crow. And so all of these have these like ripple effects that affect both Indian American relations and Indian relations. The second kind of wave of the Indian Wars happens with the last of the Sioux chiefs that kind of refused to go in, and that was there were several chiefs. The most well known is this man in the middle, Sitting Bull, and this man over here, whose name was Crazy Horse, and they also refused to go into the reservations, and it led to the most famous battle of the Indian Wars, called the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is where General George Armstrong Custer, you see him there, he's always got the big mustache. They kind of did the same thing, where he led his soldiers to capture a small group, and they were overwhelmed by hundreds of Indians, led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and all of Custer's men were killed. Custer himself was mutilated after the battle. They had trouble identifying him, and eventually after that, Crazy Horse eventually gets captured and assassinated in jail. He's murdered, stabbed in the back, or shot in the back. I can't remember which one. While in jail, Sitting Bull actually went on to become kind of a celebrity. Toured the country as like in a Indian Wild West show. before, as we'll talk about, he's finally killed at the massacre at Wounded Knee, which is the last part here, the ghost dance. This was the last bit of resistance that the Indians did. It was a religious movement led by this man right here, and it was kind of a mixture of apocalyptic Christianity, kind of Jesus will come again, and traditional Native American beliefs, where that basically there was going to be a spirit that was going to rise again and basically eliminate drive the whites from the country, and the land would belong to the Indians again. It must be emphasized that this was not a call to violence, never meant to be, but it did require dancing. You see images here of the ghost dance. There was a huge meeting called at a reservation called Wounded Knee. It was the middle of winter, but they were going to have this big, huge meeting for the ghost dance. And when the U.S. Army saw all of these Indians getting together, and then they're doing this dance that, in the undiscerning white eyes looked as every bit like what would be a war dance, they essentially opened fire and massacred all these people. Here is this is a Sioux chief named Bigfoot. This is the Wounded Knee massacre, and essentially, in a lot of cases, the bodies were left frozen in the snow. You can actually see these bodies here. This man is completely frozen, I'm sorry, Sitting Bull was killed before this. I misspoke earlier, and that kind of puts an end to the formal resistance period. Essentially, then that assimilation period leads us from the 1890s, which is when the Wounded Knee Massacre happened, all the way through into what's called the New Deal. And so we started covering the New Deal just barely at the end of our period before school came to an end. That was Franklin Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression. Of course, these Indian reservations are going to be hit hard with the Great Depression. And what you have then is, as part of the New Deal, Roosevelt signed the Indian Reorganization Act. And there it is, actually being signed in the presence of a number of Native American chiefs. And that gave control back to the tribes of their lands to do so, as they see fit. There was no longer going to be any kind of like allotment act where if the Indians weren't acting white enough, they were going to have the land taken away. And also, in fact, some of the New Deal programs were specifically aimed at Indian employment. You see down here part of a works program as part of the New Deal. If you remember, that was one of the ways to combat the Depression, was to put people to work in the employ of the U.S. government. And these men here were employed by the U.S. government. They're all Native American workers, and they're working on their reservations. Here you see warning Indian land, do not enter. And so the Indians are finally given back a much, much larger degree of autonomy over their land. Of course, there's still going to be a lot of battles. And remember that what is called their land in the 1930s, when this deal is signed, what is called their land does not encompass even the land that was promised them in the Fort Laramie Treaty. And so that's going to be kind of, honestly, to the present day, you have groups like what's called the American Indian Movement that are trying to get that land back to the people that the tribe was, that it was given to in that treaty. So that brings us to an end of that section. Thanks for listening. Please let me know on Google Classroom how this worked for you. And hopefully that will, we can keep doing stuff like this or find what does work. Thanks for watching.